Lynn sat silently in front of the mirror, her hands trembling as she held the lipstick. The warm yellow light cast a glow on her face, reflecting eyes filled with worry. Today was the most important day of their 4-year relationship, the day she would meet Min's family. 4 years together, overcoming countless hardships, yet Lynn had never felt such pressure before. Her heart pounded, each beat echoing like a drum in her chest. Outside the window, the sky was a dull gray, as if the early winter winds were adding to the chill in her heart. Min, the man she loved, was the only son of one of the most prestigious families in Hanoi. Meanwhile, Lynn was just a girl from Phu Tho, raised among endless rice fields in a humble home that her parents had spent their entire lives building. The gap between them was immense. Was love alone enough to bridge it? Min had once held her hand and smiled gently, saying, "Just be yourself. My mother will understand." But Lynn knew that saying it was far easier than doing it. Min's mother, Mrs. Ingan, was not only a powerful woman, but also famously strict. Just imagining the sharp gaze she would cast upon her was enough to make Lynn feel the weight pressing down on her shoulders. She reached for a simple white dress and slipped it on. "Just be yourself," she whispered to herself. Yet that voice couldn't drown out the waves of anxiety rising within her. She adjusted her hair, took a deep breath, and stepped outside. The taxi rolled forward slowly, carrying her toward the grand mansion she had only ever heard about from Min's stories. As the car came to a stop in front of the towering iron gates, Lynn looked up. The house before her stood majestic and imposing, like a castle straight out of a fairy tale. But she didn't feel like a princess about to step into a beautiful romance. Instead, she felt like a small traveler standing at the foot of a towering mountain, one she had to climb to prove herself. "Just be yourself." She repeated the familiar words, but this time her voice was nothing more than a whisper filled with uncertainty. She had no idea what fate awaited her beyond those gates. The massive iron gates slowly creaked open, the deep groan of metal echoing as if revealing a long-held secret. Lynn held her breath in the taxi, staring ahead. Before her, the grand mansion stood illuminated by the soft, fading light of dusk. Meticulously trimmed potted plants surrounded the estate, adding a sense of elegance and order. A pristine white stone path led straight to the main entrance. Lynn instinctively clenched her hands, a wave of hesitation rising within her. The taxi came to a stop. Min stepped out from the gate, his familiar smile like a warm breeze in the midst of the distant, cold atmosphere. "It's okay, I'm here." Min's voice was deep and gentle, as if trying to reassure her. But even as he held her hand firmly, Lynn couldn't shake the anxiety pressing down on her mind. The grand wooden doors of the mansion slowly opened. Lynn stepped inside, her footsteps echoing sharply against the polished marble floor, each sound mirroring the steady beat of her heart. The vast living room stretched before her, its towering ceiling adorned with a shimmering crystal chandelier that illuminated the lavish yet distant space. Antique paintings lined the walls, intricate decorative pieces filled the room. Everything exuded sophistication, yet there was not a trace of warmth or familiarity. Before Lynn could fully take it all in, Mrs. Nguyen, Min's mother, gracefully stepped forward. A slender woman with neatly pin-up hair, she wore a deep violet gown that flowed elegantly around her. Mrs. Nguyen was nothing like the mothers Lynn had known back home, those who were always busy with household chores, their eyes filled with warmth. Instead, she exuded authority, her sharp gaze seemingly able to see through everything, making Lynn feel as if she were an object placed on a scale for evaluation. "You must be Lynn, right? Have a seat, don't be shy." Mrs. Nyan's voice was soft, but carried undeniable authority. She sat down, lifting a teacup in one hand, her eyes sweeping over Lynn from head to toe. Within seconds, it felt as if she had already formed a dozen conclusions about her. Lynn steadied herself, smiled politely, and sat down across from her. The conversation began with a few pleasantries, but Lynn quickly realized that every question Mrs. Nguyen asked was like a sharp hook, skillfully pulling out the information she wanted. "What do your parents do for a living? You're from Phu Tho, right? Life must be hard there." Mrs. Nguyen sipped her tea as she spoke, her gaze flickering with a mix of curiosity and restraint. Lynn took a deep breath and replied gently, "Yes, my parents are farmers. It's hard work, but our family has always lived in harmony and happiness." "Is that so?" Mrs. Nyan gave a slight smile, but the curve of her lips carried no warmth. "Life in the countryside must be very different from the city. Hanoi is always busy, while the countryside is probably much more peaceful." The words seemed like casual remarks at first, but Lynn could clearly sense the hidden comparisons beneath them. As the meal was served, the tension in the air became even more palpable. The grand dining table was filled with elaborate dishes arranged like a banquet, yet the atmosphere remained cold and heavy. Mrs. Kinnean skillfully wove subtle implications into the conversation, highlighting the differences between city life and the countryside. "This dish is probably unfamiliar to people from the countryside, isn't it? Food like this takes a lot of precision to get just right." Lynn maintained a polite smile, responding with a respectful tone. She understood that every word from Mrs. Nyan was a test, a way to determine whether she was worthy of stepping into this family. Deep down, Lin couldn't help but feel a sense of loneliness. Back home, family meals were always filled with laughter, a time when everyone gathered to share joy. But here, surrounded by luxury, she had never felt smaller. Still, she refused to let herself falter. "I'm here to prove myself, not to surrender," she reminded herself. She believed that her genuine love and relentless effort would gradually break down the barriers of prejudice, turning scrutinizing glances into eventual acceptance. Min gently squeezed her hand under the table, his eyes silently telling her, "I believe in you. Don't be afraid." That gaze became the strength Lin needed to remind herself that no matter how difficult the road ahead might be, she would not give up. Mrs. Agnon glanced at the clock before turning back to Lin. Her expression remained unchanged, but in that moment, Lin realized something. Today was only the beginning. She would have to face many more challenges to prove that a girl from the countryside like her had the strength and patience to stand firm in this family. The conversation after dinner unfolded in an unsettling silence. Though no harsh words were spoken, the tension seeped into the air, spreading like invisible waves beneath the calm surface. Sitting across from Mrs. Ng, Lin tried to maintain her composure, but inside, she couldn't stop wondering what was coming next. Mrs. Ning slowly set her teacup down on the table. Her movements were deliberate, and her sharp gaze briefly flickered over Lin before she finally spoke. Her voice was gentle, yet each word carried a crushing weight. "Your family has a large debt, don't they?" The question struck like lightning in a clear sky. Lin froze, her eyes widening in shock, as if the entire room seemed to shrink, leaving only Mrs. Byung with her piercing gaze drilling into Lin's soul. Her heart pounded rapidly, and she clenched the fabric of her dress, trying to suppress the unease. But she knew this was not the moment to retreat. Taking a deep breath, Lin steadied her racing heart and met Mrs. Nguyen's eyes directly. There was no fear in her gaze, only unwavering determination. "Yes, that's right." Lin spoke, her voice soft but firm. "My family has faced difficulties, but I didn't come here because of those debts. I came because I truly love Min. My love for him is genuine, and it has nothing to do with my family's circumstances." Mrs. Nin did not respond immediately. She leaned back slightly in her chair, her sharp eyes studying Lin's every expression, as if weighing the sincerity of her words. The air grew heavy, so much so that Lin could hear her own measured breathing. Then Mrs. Nian's lips curved into a slight smile, one that carried both acknowledgement and challenge. Is that so?" she said slowly. "But do you know, at my age, people don't just listen to words. Love isn't always enough, especially when two families are so different. There are things you must prove through actions." As she finished speaking, her gaze shifted toward Min, as if searching for his agreement. But Min did not sit still. He suddenly stood up, the sharp sound of the chair scraping against the marble floor cutting through the suffocating silence. His gaze locked onto his mother's, eyes burning with determination. "Mom, I believe in Lin." Min's voice was strong, yet filled with raw emotion. "Her family's background doesn't matter to me. I love Lin because I know she is a good person, the one I want to spend my life with. And you know that if I have chosen her, it's not a reckless decision." His words struck through the tension like a direct blow. Mrs. Nian hesitated for a brief moment. The cold sharpness in her eyes flickered with a hint of surprise. She looked at Min, then turned to Lin, yet she remained silent. It seemed that Min's declaration had given her something to consider, even though her expression remained composed. Ko-Hu, Lin sat there, her heart feeling as if it were being squeezed. Mrs. Nyan's words were not just a test. They felt like a blade cutting deep into her pride. But more than anything, what hurt Lin the most was the feeling that her love for Min was being placed on a scale, measured and judged, as if it wouldn't hold enough weight without Mrs. Nyan's approval. And yet Min's gaze, filled with unwavering love and protection, gave Lin the strength to hold on. She told herself, "This is just the beginning. I must stay strong and prove that I am worthy of this love." Lin turned to look at Mrs. Nyang, her gaze gentle yet unwavering. She understood that for someone as experienced as Mrs. Nyang, words alone would never be enough. They needed to see actions, to witness relentless effort, and Lin knew that the journey ahead would not be easy, but she was ready to face it. Mrs. Nyang silently stood up and walked toward the window. She gazed out at the lush green garden, her shoulders shifting slightly as if lost in thought. After a brief moment, she turned back, her eyes losing some of their initial coldness. "Go home. I will consider it." Those words were not an acceptance, but to Lin, they were a positive sign. She gave a small nod, offering a polite smile and gratitude, even though a lingering unease still weighed on her heart. As she left the mansion, Lin walked beside Min. He took her hand and held it tightly, as if to reassure her that everything would be okay. Lin lifted her gaze to meet his, and in his eyes, she saw unwavering support. She knew that no matter how many challenges lay ahead, as long as she had Min's love and her own determination, determination, she would overcome them all. After the wedding, Lin moved in with Min's family. Inside the grand mansion, where she had once felt overwhelmed the first time she stepped in, Lin gradually realized that the exterior luxury was not the most important thing in a family. Life as a daughter-in-law was nothing like her initial, simple expectations. Behind those lavish walls were quiet challenges that Lin had never faced before. Mrs. Yingyan, her mother-in-law, maintained a polite demeanor, but Lin understood that, in her eyes, she was still just a small-town girl with a lifestyle that Mrs. Yingyan considered lacking in many ways. She never said it outright, but every word, every gesture carried subtle implications, a constant reminder that Lin needed to try much harder to prove herself worthy of this family. Every morning, as Lin woke up early to prepare breakfast for the household, Mrs. Nyan would enter the kitchen with a composed demeanor, yet her watchful eyes missed nothing. "You need to clean the house more often," she remarked as she noticed Lin tidying up. "The city is dusty. It's not like the countryside." Or, when Lin set the breakfast table, Mrs. Nyan would merely take a small sip of her tea before commenting, "This breakfast is passable at best. You need to learn more. You can't be careless." Those words seemed gentle on the surface. However, for Lin, each of Mrs. Ng's words felt like invisible needles, each one a test, a subtle comparison reminding Lin that she wasn't good enough yet. Lin didn't argue or defend herself. She simply lowered her head and gently replied, "Yes, I will try harder." But inside, she couldn't help but feel sad. She knew that, in Mrs. Nyan's eyes, her efforts were still not enough to erase the boundary between a city daughter-in-law and a girl from the countryside. Nonetheless, Lin didn't let those words discourage her. She understood that, for older individuals like Mrs. Nyan, who had lived a life bound by rules and standards, acceptance couldn't come easily. Mrs. Nyan was someone who had been through a lot, having been a daughter-in-law herself and faced societal pressures that someone like Lin, from the younger generation, couldn't fully understand. For her, everything in this family had to reach perfection, not only as an expectation, but also as a way for her to preserve the traditional values of the family. Lin remembered once when Mrs. Nyan shared a story from when she was a young daughter-in-law, back when her own mother was still young. She told the story with a thoughtful tone. "My mother didn't need anyone to remind her. She knew exactly what needed to be done to keep everything in order. Being a daughter isn't just about doing things well, it's also about doing them cleverly. How could she make sure that the elders in the house wouldn't criticize her?" These stories, seemingly shared just to connect, Lin understood that Mrs. Nyan was trying to remind her to make more of an effort to learn how to be a daughter-in-law according to the right expectations. Although sometimes feeling a bit hurt, Lin still told herself that she couldn't give up. She knew that to truly earn Mrs. Nyan's acceptance, she needed patience and sincerity. Every day, Lin still woke up early to prepare breakfast, clean the house, and always kept a smile on her face, even though, inside, there were moments when she felt sadness that she couldn't express. She didn't complain or blame anyone. She understood that to change prejudices, she couldn't do it through words, but through actions. She thought to herself, she didn't need to prove anything grand. Just by living according to her values, sincerity would speak for itself. Occasionally, Lin would catch Mrs. Ngan's gaze briefly lingering on her. Not the usual sharp gaze, but a thoughtful one, as if she were contemplating something. Perhaps she had noticed Lin's quiet efforts, but she didn't say anything. Or maybe Mrs. Ngan needed more time to truly trust her. For someone like her, who had experienced so much, time was the answer to everything. Lin realized this. Being a daughter-in-law is not just about learning to integrate into a new family, but also a journey to build trust, gradually establish oneself while maintaining respect for the previous generation. She understood that the challenges she faced today were not only a part of her life as a daughter-in-law, but also an opportunity for her to grow and learn to love and forgive, even when she had not yet received the same in return. For Mrs. Yinyan, every action Lin took was not just small daily tasks, but also a way for her to assess whether Lin had the ability to become a part of this family. And for Lin, she did these tasks not just to fulfill her responsibilities, but also to send a message. "I'm not perfect, but I truly want to do the best I can." Every morning, as the sunlight began to filter through the large windows of the mansion, Lin stood by the kitchen, preparing for a new day with determination and the belief that every effort, no matter how small, would eventually be acknowledged. She believed that time and sincerity would be the best answer to all prejudices. And one day, Mrs. Ngan would not just see her as a daughter-in-law, but as an inseparable part of this family. A major crisis hit suddenly, like an unexpected storm, sweeping away the peace the Min family once had. Min's company, which had long been a source of pride for the family, suddenly faced a severe financial crisis. A major project was canceled and a contract with Phu Tho was terminated, resulting in massive losses and insurmountable pressure. Min, once a confident and self-assured man, began to turn inward, becoming quiet and contemplative. The long sleepless nights left his eyes darkened and tired. Lee noticed that Min was growing more distant, often avoiding her and spending hours in his office, his mind trapped in a maze of numbers with no way out. She tried to ask how he was doing, but each time she was met with a quick shake of the head and a brief response, "I'm fine, don't worry." But Lin knew Min was far from fine. Then, one evening, in the dim yellow light of the room, Min looked at Lin with eyes full of helplessness. He was no longer the strong man she knew. "I have no other option," he said, his voice choking with emotion. "I have to rely on my family." Lin was stunned. She knew the company was in trouble, but she never imagined things had gotten this bad. Min, the man who had always prided himself on his independence, was now at a breaking point. Now, having to say those words, Lin took Min's hand, her gaze firm. "Don't worry, I will help." The next day, Lin returned to her hometown to visit her parents. The small house where she had grown up felt as familiar as it did before. Her parents sat across from her, listening attentively as she told them about Min's situation and the difficulties he was facing. When Lin finished speaking, the room fell into silence. The only piece of land her family still owned, the land her parents had carefully preserved as a final asset for their old age, was now going to be used to help Min. Her father sat silently, gazing out the window. He quietly took a drag from his cigarette before turning to his wife. Lin's mother didn't say anything, only nodded, her eyes briefly wet with tears. Finally, Lin's father spoke in a slow, deliberate voice, full of determination. "If this helps you to overcome your struggles, we have no regrets. What matters is that you're happy." Lin couldn't hold back her tears. She knew how much her parents loved her, but this sacrifice still left her heart heavy. The money from selling the land gave Min the financial resources to address his company's immediate problems. The company gradually recovered, and projects were slowly restored, allowing Min to regain his confidence. When Min returned home with the money, he shared the news with his family. For the first time, Mrs. Nyan, who always maintained a calm and high-handed demeanor, showed a look of astonishment. She stared at Lin, her eyes no longer filled with the usual scrutiny, but instead reflecting a mix of silence, regret, and surprise. She didn't respond immediately. She sat in silence for a long time, perhaps beginning to realize that the daughter-in-law she had once dismissed, the woman she thought was not good enough, was now the one willing to sacrifice everything to save her family. In that moment, between Mrs. Gahan's quiet gaze and Lin's gentle smile, it seemed as though an invisible wall had started to crumble. For the first time, Mrs. Gahan felt the need to reconsider her judgment of Lin. She understood that a person's true worth is not determined by where they come from, but by what they do. Lin had proven this with her heart and sacrifices, without needing any justification. That evening, as the family gathered around the dinner table, the atmosphere felt warmer. Min looked at Lin with gratitude in his eyes. Mrs. Ingen remained silent throughout the meal, but her gaze often lingered on Lin, as if she wanted to say something. Though she didn't speak, Lin understood that change had begun. She didn't need immediate recognition, but she believed that time and sincere love would accomplish what words could not. After the major crisis, the atmosphere in Min's family seemed to soften noticeably. Mrs. Inyan, who had always maintained a cold and distant attitude toward Lin, began to change in ways she may not have even realized. She no longer scrutinized Lin's every small action, nor did she offer harsh criticisms or cast judging looks whenever Lin did the housework. Instead, she gradually started to notice the small things that Lin quietly did every day, things that she had once overlooked. One morning, while everyone was still asleep, Mrs. Guion woke up earlier than usual and made her way to the kitchen. She saw Lin standing by the stove, her posture tired. Mrs. Guion's gaze lingered on Lin's hands, quickly preparing breakfast. It seemed like Lin had just gone through a long, restless night. Her shoulders slumped slightly, but she continued working diligently. Everything was in order. In that moment, Mrs. Ingen paused, not entering the kitchen right away. Her gaze grew thoughtful, as if searching through her own memories. The sight of Lin suddenly reminded her of her own youth. She remembered when she had once been a daughter-in-law herself, managing the household on her own during the most challenging times. She recalled the mornings when she woke up early, quietly preparing meals for the family, even though others took it for granted. That sacrifice she had never spoken of or expected recognition for. Now she saw something similar in Lin, and that thought lingered in her mind throughout the day. The next morning, as she descended to the kitchen again, she saw Lin still diligently working. But this time, she didn't just observe from the outside. She approached Lin, placed her hand on her shoulder, and gently said, "Let me help you with this." That short sentence was simple, but Lin felt a wave of warmth spread through her. She looked up at Mrs. Ingen, her eyes showing both surprise and deep emotion. Wynne smiled and nodded softly. It was not just an offer of help, but a sign of a significant shift in their relationship. From that point on, Mrs. Ingen began to take more interest in Wynne. The sharp criticisms that had once been so common were replaced by caring questions. "Are you tired? Let me help you more." Or, "Min is so busy, don't overexert yourself." Women with families need to take care of their health or they'll hurt themselves. She also spent more time with the grandchildren, and on nights when Lin needed rest, Mrs. Nyan would help out. She often took the initiative to care for for the baby, allowing Lin time to relax. During these moments, she would often look at Lin with a gaze that carried a hint of regret for what she had once thought of her. Although Lin never voiced it, she deeply appreciated these changes in her. She didn't expect her mother-in-law to apologize or express anything because, for Lin, her actions spoke volumes. Whenever Mrs. Nyan asked what she wanted to eat or personally cooked her favorite dish, Lin felt the acceptance coming from her heart, not just as a duty of someone older in the family. These small changes, over time, helped build a stronger bond between Lin and Mrs. Nyan. From someone who had kept a distance, Mrs. Nyan now saw Lin not just as a daughter-in-law, but as an indispensable part of the family. She understood that a harmonious family required more than expectations and demands from the older generation. Love and understanding were the true forces that brought everyone together. Lin, through her patience and sincerity, had proven her worth without needing any justification, while Mrs. Nyan, through her quiet but noticeable changes, showed that even those with deeply rooted prejudices and habits could learn to change if they opened their hearts to listen and recognize the good in others. One late autumn evening, the Min family gathered around the dinner table. Outside, the cold wind blew, but inside the mansion, the warm glow from the crystal chandelier made the space feel intimate and peaceful. As usual, the sound of a child's laughter echoed, mixing with the light-hearted conversations between family members. Lin was busy arranging the dessert, her face showing a hint of fatigue, but still glowing with happiness at seeing her family together. Mrs. Ngyan sat at the head of the table, quietly observing Lin. Her hands were clasped together, and her eyes seemed to hold something unsaid. Just as Lin placed a plate of fruit on the table, Mrs. Nyan unexpectedly spoke. Her voice, no longer sharp as it usually was warm, slow, and sincere. "Lin, please sit down. I have something to say." The room fell silent. Lin looked up at his mother, a trace of surprise in his eyes, while Lin paused, her hand still holding the napkin. She hesitated for a moment, but calmly sat next to Min, her eyes showing a flicker of unease. Yet she maintained her composure. Mrs. Yan studied Lin for a moment, as if weighing her words carefully, then sighed, her gaze softening. "I was wrong about you," she began. Her voice trembled, as if these words had been hidden for a long time. "I didn't see what you were doing, and I didn't understand your value. But now," she admitted, "that you are not only a good wife, but also a mother to be truly proud of. I am sorry for the things I have done and the prejudices I once held." The room fell into silence. Lin stood still, her eyes slightly red. These words, which she had never dared to hope for, now echoed so sincerely that they filled her heart with emotion. Lin bowed her head, then looked up at Mrs. Yanyan. Her face was gentle, and her lips formed a soft smile, filled with gratitude. "I just want to do my best in my role," Lin responded, her voice soft but clear. "Thank you, Mom, for changing and for saying these words to me. It really means a lot." Min silently took Lin's hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. He didn't say anything, but his eyes were filled with pride and appreciation. Mrs. Nyen, for the first time, looked at Lin with eyes full of genuine affection. There was no more judgment or suspicion. From that day on, the relationship between Lin and her mother-in-law completely changed. The distance that had once existed gradually faded, replaced by love and closeness. Mrs. Nyen no longer saw Lin as an outsider, but as her own daughter. The previous prejudices about the differences between the city and the countryside, about things she once considered incompatible, had now become part of the past. Lin could also feel the lightness in her heart with each passing day. She no longer had to worry about her mother-in-law's gaze or words. Instead, she received support and companionship from her in everything, from caring for the child to preparing family meals. Mrs. Nyan often took the time to cook dishes that Lin liked, sharing stories from the past with a warmth she had never shown before. In the evenings, the whole family gathered together, laughter and conversation filling the air. Lin thought to herself that this was the family she had always dreamed of. She understood that her patience and sincerity had finally been rewarded, and more importantly, she realized that no one was beyond change when love and understanding were prioritized. The relationship between Lin and Mrs. Ingen had evolved into more than just a harmonious mother-in-law and daughter-in-law bond. It had become a genuine connection between two women from different generations, both learning how to love and respect each other. At Mrs. Ingen's age, she had also come to realize that the most valuable thing in a family was not perfection or standards, but empathy and sincerity. As time passed quietly, each day marked a profound change within Min's family. The bond between Lin and Mrs. Ingan not only improved, but became a source of unity. The most important change is that Mrs. Ingan, who once held strict prejudices, now not only sees Lin as a daughter-in-law, but also as her own daughter. To her, Lin is not just Min's wife, but an irreplaceable part of the family, someone she can share with and trust. When Lin gave birth to her first child, the entire family joyfully welcomed the new member. Mrs. Nyan became the most supportive helper. On the nights when Lin was exhausted from the baby's crying, Mrs. Nyan did not hesitate to stay up late, taking care of the baby to give Lin some rest. Whenever Lin felt lost in her new role as a mother, Mrs. Neon gently guided her, teaching her everything from how to hold the baby to breastfeeding, and even choosing nutritious foods. I didn't have these modern methods back in the day, Mrs. Neon says, and said, smiling as she looked at her sleeping grandchild in her arms. But the most important thing is to care with all your heart. Don't rush. No pressure. I'm here. Her words of encouragement not only helped Lin gain more confidence, but they also made her feel the genuine love that her mother-in-law had for her. Lin no longer felt lost as she did in the early days of being a daughter-in-law. Instead, she received support and companionship from the woman who had once been the most critical of her. Family meals were now always filled with laughter. Mrs. Nyan no longer had the scrutinizing gaze or sharp remarks. Instead, she happily shared stories from the past about Min's childhood, her voice warm and cheerful. Lin sat next to them, listening attentively and occasionally asking witty questions that made the whole family laugh out loud. Min looked at his wife and mother with a sense of contentment in his eyes. He knew that this harmony didn't happen by chance. It was the result of efforts from both of the most important women in his life. On weekends, the whole family often gathered together. Min would take his wife and child out to the garden while Mrs. Ingen busied herself preparing meals. Family dinners were no longer just about eating. They had become a time for everyone to share, understand, and grow closer. The story of Lin and Mrs. Inyan was not merely about the harmony between a mother-in-law and daughter-in-law. It was a living testament to how love, patience, and understanding can break down any barriers. The change in Mrs. Inyan came not only from Lin's efforts, but also from her own openness, her willingness to listen, and her ability to recognize the good in others. The misunderstandings and prejudices that once existed in the past had now become valuable lessons, not just for Lin and Mrs. Ingen, but for the entire family. They learned that creating a home full of happiness doesn't require perfection, but understanding, respect, and love. That afternoon, when the warm golden sunlight bathed the garden, the whole family sat together. Lin was holding the baby, while Mrs. Yan sat beside her, gazing lovingly at her grandchild. Min smiled, holding his wife's hand. His eyes sparkled with joy. In that moment, it felt as though everything had come together perfectly. This home once seemed on the verge of falling apart due to differences and prejudices, but now it shines brighter than ever. It has become a place full of laughter, love, and connection, where everyone has learned to forgive, to love, and to appreciate one another. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this meaningful story. It is not only about the journey of harmony between a mother-in-law and daughter-in-law, but also a profound lesson on love, patience, and understanding. Sometimes, in order to build a strong relationship, we must overcome prejudices, learn to understand, and appreciate each other's value. If this story has touched your heart, please support our channel by liking the video, leaving a comment to share your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss any future meaningful stories. Your support is the motivation for us to bring more valuable content. Thank you very much.